Welcome back. In these next two lectures, we're going to be turning to a very different intellectual and philosophical tradition and a very different account of the meaning of life. We'll be addressing Native American traditions. Now, when we address Native American culture and Native American traditions, particularly in the contemporary social, cultural, and political landscape in the wake of tremendous genocide against Native American people, we have to tread very, very lightly. For one thing, we have to be careful not to treat all Native American cultures as though they're the same. North America contained hundreds of Native American cultures before the coming of Europeans, and still contains and is home to hundreds of Native American traditions, and we can't pretend to be representing all of them. The particular text that we'll be looking at is from a very particular tradition, namely that of the Lakota Sioux. These traditions included many different languages, many different kinds of beliefs, many philosophical perspectives. Until very recently, all of these traditions were oral. They did not include written texts. And not all of the Native American traditions are even available to people outside of the tribal cultures. This, of course, is because some of these spiritual traditions, some of these philosophical traditions are regarded as private, are regarded as available to inside people, but not made public. And even those of us who are privileged to be able to read in English published work from particular cultures in which people have chosen to make their philosophical beliefs and arguments available, we don't have the oral tradition that underlies these. And given that so many of these texts arise from oral traditions and are addressed primarily to people who are steeped in those cultures and oral traditions, we have to be aware of the fact that in our reading and our interpretation, we may unconsciously be distorting those traditions. So I think we need to read with a great deal of delicacy, and a great deal of respect, and a great deal of care. The two principal texts that we have available to us as readers of English that represent Native American philosophical views are both those of Lakota Sioux. One is the great text by Black Elk called Black Elk Speaks. The second, the one that we'll be discussing today, is by John Fire Lame Deer, and it is called Lame Deer Seeker of Visions. I'm really quite taken by Lame Deer's work. It's very philosophically systematic in a way that Black Elk is focused more on ritual, more on religious practice, and remarkably eloquent. And I hope you're going to enjoy working through parts of that text with me, and I hope especially that you will enjoy some of Lame Deer's beautiful prose. In some respects, we're going to see that Lame Deer shares insights with some of the other critics of modernity whose work we've examined. In particular, along with Nietzsche, we're going to see that he's a real critic of mass-produced people, as Nietzsche referred to them as herd animals. Lame Deer will sometimes use fairly similar metaphors, actually. He's really worried about the ability of modern culture to dumb down, to homogenize, and to alienate people from their own real existence. Lame Deer also shares part of Tolstoy's critique. We saw that Tolstoy had this deep insight that modern mass culture is connected in very deep ways to a valorization of consumption and a particular kind of lifestyle taken as normative, a middle-class lifestyle. And Tolstoy saw that this kind of consumerism and this kind of focus on normalcy, on living as people ought to live, is ruinous to our spiritual lives and in a deep way alienates us from interpersonal relations and alienates us, therefore, from what makes life worth living. Lame Deer will share that insight as well. Gandhi argued that modern life alienates us further from our moral values, that modernity forces us to lead lives in which we're complicit in harms and social structures that we can't possibly endorse, and that it's necessary, if we're going to save ourselves from this kind of alienation, to rebel against modernity and to construct an alternative. We'll see that Lame Deer agrees with that as well. But Lame Deer goes a bit deeper. Lame Deer connects modernity and the mass culture that it generates to an alienation not just from other people, not just from moral values, but from ourselves, from our own nature, and from the world of nature that we inhabit. So Lame Deer's critique goes very deeply. He argues that modernity is poisonous, not just because it alienates us from other people and from the lives we want to lead, but because it makes us strangers to ourselves. And Lame Deer adds one further insight to this critique. That is, Lame Deer focuses on an aspect of modernity that might have escaped some of these others, though it was one that Mill was hinting at, and that is the totalizing character of modernity. Lame Deer points out that when we accept the values of contemporary modern life, they assume a kind of universality that makes it impossible for us to even see alternatives. We end up adopting a regime of ideology, of morality, of taking up with life, and a conception of normalcy that takes over our way of seeing the world. And as a consequence, we end up not only leading a life that's unreflective, self-alienated, and eventually empty and meaningless. That's not all. More deeply, not only do we lead such a life, but within that life, we don't even see that there are alternatives. We don't even take seriously the possibility that there are alternative values that might give us or others meaningful lives to lead. As a consequence, Lame Deer thinks, modernity doesn't only construct a prison for us, but it's a prison without any windows. It's a prison that we can't even see out of and imagine alternatives to. And it generates in us a very deep amnesia about freedom. And that deep amnesia, that forgetting what it is to be free, forgetting what it is to lead a meaningful life, ends up making us accept our imprisonment and adopt it willingly, to construct our own prisons and to be complicit in our own confinement. As I said, we're going to be working through Lame Deer's text, and I'm going to do as much as possible of this through Lame Deer's own words. Lame Deer lived from about 1903, we're not sure of his exact birth date, to about 1976. And he was a really interesting person. He grew up on a Lakota Sioux reservation, on the Rosebud Reservation, and his early life was quite wild. He rode in the rodeo. He was apparently somewhat fond of drink and womanizing and was often on the wrong side of the law and led a fairly rowdy youth. But at some point, as he recalls it, after a fair amount of wildness, he accidentally stumbled into the home of another Lakota Sioux, an elderly woman who was keeper of the Lakota peace pipe, the pipe that was, according to legend, according to tradition, handed down from the very beginning of the Lakota nation. And she told him, "I've been waiting for you." And thus began his apprenticeship and his subsequent career as a very eminent Sioux medicine man and speaker for Native American people. As I said, his book, which was published in 1972, Lame Deer Seeker Revisions, is, I believe, the most eloquent statement of Native American philosophy available in English. The context in which the Lakota seek the meaning of life is a very large context. It's not only the social world, as we might have seen for Aristotle or Confucius. It's this large context of the natural world. All of the texts we've been reading so far have been emphasizing that in order to lead a meaningful life, we need somehow to connect our small, finite lives to a much larger context. Almost always, though, either a universal context, as we've seen in the Gita or the Book of Job, or for the Stoics, or a social context, as we've seen for Aristotle, for Gandhi, for the Confucians. The Lakota emphasize something kind of in between. That is the context of nature. And that context embodies a sense, again, shared with Nietzsche, that first and foremost, human beings are animals, living among animals in a natural ecosystem, including animals and plants, and that our community thus transcends the human community in very fundamental and very important ways. Taking this seriously entails developing a kind of reverence for other animals, not just as beautiful, not just as elegant, not just as cute, but in some sense as our peers, as members of our culture who have obligations to us and to whom we have obligations, with whom we are in social relations. And it also entails developing a respect and a care for the environment that sustains not only us, but the other animals and plants who are members of our relevant moral community. It also, of course, entails developing a very deep internalized sense of temporality, of time. And that's because the natural world is marked by so many temporal cycles. Cycles of day and night, cycles of the month, of the moon, annual cycles, cycles of seasons, reproductive cycles, and so forth. And so we'll see that in the Lakota tradition, this awareness of temporality and of connectedness to the natural world plays a very, very important role. Another issue that we'll see is very important for the Lakota is the nature of symbols and the pervasiveness of the symbolic. Lame Deer sees the world as defined by its symbolic character and sees that symbolism as absolutely central to the meaning of life. And we're going to begin by talking about the nature of those symbols and the nature of interpretation of those symbols. Moving from there, we'll talk about the ubiquity of those symbols. We'll talk a little bit about names as symbols, and finally, the role of symbols in ritual. But let's begin by talking about the nature of symbols themselves and their connection to meaning. Way back at the very beginning of this course, in the first lecture, we talked about the many meanings of the word meaning. And we noted that one of them is the one we've been focusing on, that is significance in this greater sense. But a second one was the notion of the symbolic, where a word means something. The word bachelor means unmarried man. The word J means me. The word sun refers to that thing in the sky. And so far, that notion of meaning, the symbolic, has not figured at all in our discussions. But that notion of meaning is the one that is central, as we will see, to Lakota thinking. To the Lakota, as Lame Deer will emphasize, life as a whole, our entire lives, are permeated with symbols, things that actually mean something in this linguistic sense. And part of the meaning of life is the meaning of those symbols. And part of what makes our lives meaningful is that our lives themselves can be seen as symbols, as symbolic. For that reason, our life in nature is meaningful because the nature of which we are a part is meaningful. Notice, just saying that we need to live our lives naturally means nothing if nature itself isn't meaningful. And the meaningfulness of nature, Lame Deer will emphasize, consists in its symbolic character. Lame Deer himself puts the point so eloquently like this. He says, "From birth to death, we Indians are enfolded in symbols as in a blanket." Let's turn to one of his favorite examples. Lame Deer, making this wonderful description of an ordinary object, says, "It doesn't seem to have a message, that old pot." He's pointing to a cooking pot now. "And I guess you don't give it a thought, except the soup smells good and reminds you that you're hungry. But I'm an Indian. I think about ordinary, common things like this pot. The bubbling water comes from the rain cloud. It represents the sky." Pause on that for a moment. It represents the sky. The water itself is symbolic of the cloud, not just caused by it, but it represents it. When I see the water, the clouds come to mind, just as when I say the word cloud, the clouds come to mind. The fire comes from the sun, which warms us all, men, animals, trees. The meat stands for the four-legged creatures, our animal brothers, who gave of themselves that we should live. Once again, it's representational, not just causal. The steam is living breath. It was water. Now it goes up to the sky, becomes a cloud again. These things are sacred. That's a really important point. Each of these commonplace things, the water in the pot, the steam, the heat, is a symbol that calls to our mind something sacred, something greater to us. So for the Native American speaker, simply looking at the pot is to look at a host of symbols that remind us that we live in this vast sacred order. Lame Deer continues, "Looking at this pot full of good soup, I'm thinking how, in this simple manner, Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, takes care of me. We Sioux spend a lot of time thinking about everyday things, which in our minds are mixed up with the spiritual. We see in the world around us many symbols that teach us the meaning of life." That's it. These symbols around us are actually language, the language of the universe, teaching the meaning of life. You, now he's talking to non-Native Americans, we see a lot that you no longer notice. You could notice it if you wanted to, but you are usually too busy. We Indians live in a world of symbols and images where the spiritual and commonplace are one. What to you seems commonplace, to us appears wondrous through symbolism. Notice that. By understanding and living in the world as a world full of symbols, the world becomes wondrous because the world itself becomes saturated with representation of the sacred. Every possible thing, even an old cooking pot, becomes something potentially sacred. Lame Deer continues, this is funny, because we don't even have a word for symbolism, yet we are all wrapped up in it. You have the word, but that is all. There's a lot here. There's a stinging indictment of the modern way of seeing the world. Lame Deer is pointing out that if we simply understand the world in this symbolic dimension, this affects a kind of transfiguration of the commonplace, the ordinary, the everyday, the trivial, into a sacred world through this symbolic activity. He's also pointing out to us the absolute ubiquity of symbolization, that it's every place, and that it's totally natural. We don't have to make it up. All we have to do is open our eyes and observe. And that by observing these symbols and taking them seriously, we develop a much deeper connection to the natural world. And that connection is a connection to a sacred natural world that is immanent, in which we dwell, and that gives our lives meaning. He's also emphasizing the importance of developing the skill of noticing, and also attend to how spontaneously he sees the world that way. That wasn't a studied, careful reflection about a pot. That was a spontaneous articulation of how the world appears when it's seen this way. Now, Lame Deer points out that there's also a human world of symbols, and as natural animals, that's part of the natural world too. He points to names and to rituals, that when we name ourselves or name our children, we're establishing symbols. And he's pointing out that this isn't the model for symbols. It's not as though we begin with names and begin with linguistic words, and then we extrapolate from that to find things like cooking pots or steam to be symbolic. Instead, human names, human language, is just one instance among thousands of the symbolic. That the symbolic is a much grander affair, a much more natural affair than just something that we instantiate. So Lame Deer says, words too are symbols and convey great powers, especially names. We receive great gifts from the source of a name. It links us to nature, to the animal nations. It gives power. And in discussing names, Lame Deer contrasts the names that Native American people use, in which the significance of the name is very clear, very public, and well known to everybody. And he contrasts these with the names that non-Native people use, names like Jay or Bob or Sam, which even though they in fact do have meanings and have lexical roots in Greek or Hebrew that have got meanings, most of us don't even know the meanings of our own names. And so the names themselves, even though they are potentially symbolic and potentially link ourselves to something greater, are eviscerated of all of their significance. Now, a beautiful discussion that Lame Deer enters with regard, again, to symbolism and the link to the sacred is his discussion of the Native American Sundance. The Sundance is an extraordinary ritual. It involves a day-long dance in hot sun in which the dancers have leather thongs literally sewn through their chests so that they're bound by their skin and attached to a pole. And they dance around and around this pole for hours with a bone whistle between their teeth, whistling. They are allowed no food, no drink, no rest. Their chests are bleeding. It's extraordinarily exhausting, extraordinarily painful. And by the end of the dance, the leather thongs pull free and blood rushes down their chests. And there are these big wounds. It's a very painful ritual. Many people have looked at this and seen it as horrible, as barbaric, as masochistic, as a crazy ritual. But Lame Deer emphasizes that this ritual is in fact a deep symbolic sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of oneself, a sacrifice of one's body, of one's sensations, of one's endurance. And that's important, he argues, because we are the only things that we in fact have to sacrifice. Everything else already belongs to the rest of the universe. Sacrificing possessions is to sacrifice something that comes and goes. To sacrifice ourselves, though, is serious. Connect this, if you will, to the insight in the Bhagavad Gita, the insight that bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, is necessary in order for our lives to really be lived in a meaningful unity with the universe. But here, what we see is this ritual not only is reinforcing a vision of unity of the universe through devotion, but also establishing myself, not myself, but the self of the person in this ritual as a symbol, him or herself. The dancer himself becomes a symbol of his own devotion, and it's the symbol with which others interact. It makes our own lives representational. That is, it makes our lives meaningful. Now, Lame Deer continues this with a wonderful contrast of Native American symbols with what he sees as the symbols of modernity. And this will get to a very deep issue about the structure of Lame Deer's critique of modernity. Let's follow his thinking. Lame Deer says, to our way of thinking, that is the Native American way, the Indian symbol is the circle, the hoop. Nature wants things to be round. The bodies of human beings and animals have no corners. With us, the circle stands for the togetherness of people who sit with one another around the campfire. So again, we're thinking about the circle not only as resembling and describing the character of nature, the being without corners, but it also stands for or represents the idea that people sit in a circle around a campfire. So it's a representational symbol. He continues, the nation was in itself only part of the universe. It's self-circular. Again, when we look at the universe and the skies, we see this kind of celestial spheres, as the Greeks would have put it. The sky looks like a great circle above us. The planets and the stars move in circular motion. And made of the earth, which is round, again, circles, of the sun, which is round, of the stars, which are round, the moon, the horizon, and the rainbow, circles within circles within circles, with no beginning and no end. To us, says Lame Deer, this is beautiful and fitting, symbol and reality at the same time, expressing the harmony of life and nature. Again, notice that. Symbol and reality at the same time. It's very important for this conception of meaningfulness in symbols, that symbols and reality don't stand apart from one another. Often when we think about symbols, we think immediately of the distinction between the symbol and that to which it refers. So the name Jay is different from the person Jay. The word sun doesn't give you sunburn like the real sun does. So we really focus on the distinction between symbol and reality. But if, on the other hand, we see with Lame Deer the idea that the universe itself is already saturated with the symbolic, and that symbolic is natural to it, not imposed from outside by our conceptual activity, but part of nature, then we see that there's no distance between symbol and reality. Each reality is a symbol. Each symbol is perfectly real. And sometimes things are even self-symbolic, like the circle, which symbolizes itself as well as other things. Lame Deer continues, our circle is timeless, flowing. It is new life emerging from death, life winning out over death. Now he draws the contrast. The white man's symbol is the square. Square is his house, his office buildings, with square walls that separate people from one another. These all have corners and sharp edges, points in time, white man's time, with appointments, time clocks, and rush hours. That's what the corners mean to me. Let's focus on that for a minute. You might think that what Lame Deer was about to say is that while the Native Americans have a world rich with symbols, non-Native people, European people, live in a world that's devoid of the symbolic. That would be interesting. He's gone one step deeper, though. What Lame Deer is really suggesting here is not that our world is devoid of the symbolic, but that it's full of symbols. They're just the wrong symbols. They're symbols of really unfortunate things. Squares for him are symbols of separation. They're symbols of sharp edges. They're symbols of seeing the world as punctate, points in time, with appointments, time clocks, rush hours, instead of continuous and flowing, as he suggested the circle is. Now, this is deep, because what it means is not that we simply fail to live in a symbolic order, but that we live in a symbolic order that A, we don't recognize to be symbolic, and so it gets to work on us subconsciously without reflection, without conscious interpretation, and B, it's symbolic of exactly what deprives ourselves of our humanity, of our connection to nature, and eventually even of our connection to each other, to the things that we value. As he concludes, you become a prisoner inside those boxes, that is, those office buildings and those houses. So Lame Deer is emphasizing the pervasiveness of symbol, even in the life that we lead, even if we don't notice them. But he's also emphasizing the view that a really meaningful life is the organic life, the life that's in unity with nature, the life that's represented by the circle, as opposed to the artificial square life. This is the deep part of Lame Deer's critique of European modernity. It should feel somewhat familiar, a critique in terms of alienation, a critique in terms of the power of modernity to alienate us from what we actually value most, even reflectively. But it's also somewhat new because of this symbolic nature, this emphasis on representation, and this emphasis on nature itself as being the object from which we are alienated. So the idea is we're surrounded simply by the wrong symbols. And even though we don't notice them, we end up responding to these symbols. That's central, the central point to take away from Lame Deer's understanding of what the universe is like and of what is wrong with modernity. What's wrong with modernity is not that it fails to be meaningful. Not at all. It is meaningful. It is symbolic. It is representational. What's wrong with modernity, as far as Lame Deer is concerned, is that it means the wrong things. When we pay attention to what in fact gives our lives meaning as we live them, they're not the values that we would reflectively endorse. They're not the values that we would hope to endorse. They're rather these values that keep us prisoners, that keep us square. In our next lecture, what we're going to do is to examine how Lame Deer suggests we respond to this critique, what Lame Deer thinks that a meaningful life looks like, and how we can lead a life that's enfolded in more positive symbols. But that's going to require first a deeper understanding of the nature of the alienation, and that's where we're going to begin.